welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And this week we are discussing a novel. It is time for Sparkling Cyanide.
Ooh, it's such a sexy title.
I love this title, and I believe that is a perfect segue, Catherine, into the publication history, because I have to say, this is one of those rare times I not only love the UK title, the US title is pretty good as well.
You know, it's not terrible. So this was first published actually in the US in February of 1945 by, of course, Todd Mead, but it was titled Remembered Death. And so when it was published in December 1945 by, of course, Collins Crime in the UK, it was under Christie's actual title, which was Sparkling Cyanide.
Yeah, and this novel is technically an expansion on a short story called Yellow Iris, which was published in 1937. And that was actually a Poirot short story, and this is not a Poirot novel. We are actually going to save our discussion of Yellow Iris and the adaptation of Yellow Iris by our dear David Suchet for our next episode, which will, of course, be a short story episode. So just keep that in the back of your heads.
It turns out that this was adapted, Yellow Iris, rather, was adapted for the BBC as a radio play, and it marks Poirot's radio debut.
We discussed really briefly in our Patreon episode about BBC radio adaptations how there were a few radio adaptations.
And how Agatha had a little bit of a problem with some of them.
With some of them, yeah. And there weren't that many during her life because she was concerned, and for good reason, about any adaptation in any medium of her novels, which is why we have that flowering of BBC radio adaptations starting in the 80s and then, of course, continuing into the 90s and the aughts. And today, our next Patreon episode will be all about The Floating Admiral. And that is a book that every Christie completist will want to have read and analyzed because Christie wrote one chapter of it with other fellow members of her detection club. It was published in 1931. And we haven't covered it thus far because it's not a Christie title per se, but I think it'll be of great interest to many of you. So go to www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha if you'd like to check that out. That will be coming out at the beginning of next month. But in any case, let's move on and talk about the victims in Sparkling Cyanide.
So first we have Rosemary Barton, and she was poisoned with cyanide in her champagne on her birthday at the very glamorous Luxembourg. It's the name of the restaurant. It's not in Luxembourg. And it's sort of like a dinner club. There's performances. And that happens a year before most of the events in the story.
The second victim is George Barton, who was Rosemary's husband, who was also poisoned with cyanide, also at the Luxembourg a year after Rosemary's death. And if that sounds strange, it is, and we will get into why and how that happens. Moving on to our suspects, we have an almost closed circle here of the people who were attending the dinner, but it's not quite that closed. So first up is Iris Marl, who is Rosemary's little sister. She is present at both of those dinners where her sister and then her sister's husband die, as were the following four people.
So next we have Anthony Brown, who is a handsome, young, ambiguously North American businessman. The most interesting thing to me about him is that they keep describing that he doesn't have an accent. And given this is a book written by a Brit, I kept wondering what exactly that meant he sounded like.
Yeah, that's true.
He was very enamored with Rosemary at one point, but he is now dating Iris.
There is not one but two references made to the moment that Romeo, after seeing Juliet, thinks back to Rosaline.
I know.
Upon a reread, I remembered those references. They're a little cheesy, but they get the point across that Anthony Brown thought Rosemary was the bee's knees until he saw Iris, his Juliet.
Yes.
Christie loves her Juliet references, doesn't she?
A lot of Julia references. It's like an odd choice, isn't it?
Yeah. Next up, we have Ruth Lessing, who is George's highly competent and attractive and also ambitious secretary.
Then we have Stephen Faraday, who's an up-and-coming... Well, originally, he's a Labour MP, but then he switches to become a Conservative MP because apparently that was where promising for up-and-comers.
Very pragmatic, our Stephen Faraday.
Very pragmatic. Yeah, he doesn't have any ideology. He just has ambition. And he was having an affair with Rosemary.
Then next up, we have Lady Alexandra Faraday, who goes by Sandra, and she is Stephen's highly connected wife. She comes from the Kidderminster clan. Mm-hmm. She is a rather intense and also ambitious person.
And then, although they were not at the dinner, we have Lucilla Drake, who is a relative to Rosemary and Iris.
I think she's technically a half aunt, right?
Yes. Iris, for the most part, is still 17. She turns 18 later in the novel.
Yeah, Iris is almost like her ward, and Lucilla is her guardian of sorts. So she is related, and then because she's related, so is our final suspect, Victor Drake, who is Lucilla's ne'er-do-well son. And this is a character we have seen many, 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 many a time in Christie. Think Philip Lombard, and think also Christie's own brother, Monty, which is
right. I was going to say,
this character seems to appear so often.
Yeah, that's exactly why. So the world as it appears to be, Kemper. We open on a structure, and we've seen it before, Towards Zero, and then There Were None. We've seen it in Five Little Pigs. We're getting a chapter for every character and essentially their perspective on this situation. While it's not first person, it is definitely from the perspective of each of the main characters at that dinner in the first basically half of the book.
Friend of the podcast, John Curran, actually summed it up pretty well in his book on Agatha Christie's notebooks. He said that there are structural similarities to Five Little Pigs with the reminiscences of Six People of an earlier poisoning. We discover Rosemary Barton through the eyes of the suspects, with a different picture emerging in each account. Through individual memories in the first 70 pages of the book, we see her as wife, sister, niece, lover, friend, adulterer, and finally, victim. While the portrayal is not as full as the earlier novel, i.e. Five Little Pigs, it is still admirably drawn. I think that's a fair analysis of the first half of the book, because it's impressive what Christie's doing, and it really did remind me of Five Little Pigs in a good way.
You know, the first half of this book is much stronger than the rest of the book.
Yeah. I just even appreciated, like, we get book one, Rosemary, then with just a blank page with nothing on it other than six people were thinking of Rosemary Barton, who had died nearly a year ago. Ellipses. Mm-hmm. That's a bold way to start a novel, and she's done so many of these novels at this point. I love when she continues to experiment and do interesting things.
I appreciated that. I actually like that it's split into 3 books.
Yeah, it for sure starts strong. So we begin with Iris, who is Rosemary's much younger sister, and we learn a few key things from her. She didn't really know her older sister, Rosemary. And we also learn that Rosemary had been depressed after an illness, right? She had had a really bad flu, which had seemingly left her down in spirits.
I like that that's a condition, and I now want to use it in my real life.
Christie actually uses it in a Miss Marple short story we haven't gotten to yet, The Case of the Caretaker, where it is Miss Marple who is recovering from a flu and feeling depressed, and Dr. Haydock tempts her out of her depression with a mystery of his own that he has written. More on that weird little setup to come, but apparently it was a thing because Christie used it at least twice. Sure.
I guess. Yeah, but I mean, it's apparently left her in such a bad place that she sort of seems to be writing not a will exactly, but guidance about how she wants her inheritance split out.
Yeah, there's actually a really odd setup in terms of inheritance here, which is also a very important thing that we learn about in this first section of the story with Iris. And it is that there was a kindly uncle figure who had been spurned, I believe, by Rosemary's mother, but become a family friend. And he decided to leave his entire fortune to Rosemary specifically when he died. But if Rosemary dies childless, then the money is to go to Iris. It's odd because Iris didn't get half the money off the bat.
I know. It's just like she just got completely overlooked. And then all of a sudden it's supposed to go to her so long as Rosemary doesn't have any children.
This is the first indication in this book, I think, that the plot requirements pull at the seams of the overall story in terms of believability, because you can see that Christie's setting something up here because she needs for it to exist, but it doesn't feel quite real.
So we're adding this after the fact, but one of our listeners contacted us with the excellent point that what's probably going on here is that Rosemary's mother had an affair with this kindly uncle figure, who was in fact Rosemary's biological father, i.e. Rosemary and only Rosemary gets this man's inheritance because she is in fact his daughter. That is eminently believable, and it fits in with the sort of posh yet somewhat trashy goings-on of this novel, helping to make sense of this inheritance point. We always want to give Christie credit where it's due, so we just wanted to mention that.
Obviously, Rosemary having died has now made Iris an heiress. She's not quite of age yet, but she is going to come into an incredible amount of money because Rosemary is dead. So that right there is a motivation. Aside from all of this, we learn that Rosemary also apparently had love letters hidden in random pockets of her robes, written to someone named Leopard. And we don't know who that is. Leopard is a nickname. So we know that Rosemary seems to have been carrying on some sort of an affair. And then we also know from Iris that Rosemary's husband, George, has become increasingly odd and paranoid. And it turns out the reason why is that he's been receiving mystery letters for months now, implying that Rosemary was, in fact, murdered and did not commit suicide at the Luxembourg. It is this very dramatic scene at this restaurant where the lights go down and there's a little show and they're all arranged around the table. And when the lights come up, Rosemary is dead, and there are many references to her blue face.
Right.
And
cyanosed.
Her cyanosed face. Okay, so here's the interesting thing. So forgive me, Catherine, but you're going to have to let me geek out for a second in a way that I haven't done for a while on this podcast.
I occasionally enjoy these interludes.
So this novel, given that we are discussing sparkling cyanide, this is a perfect opportunity to bring up A is for Arsenic by Catherine Harkup, which we have referenced before on this podcast.
Which is excellent.
It is excellent. And I have to say, I think that the C is for Cyanide section is the best section I've read yet. There were so many interesting tidbits that Harkup included in here. First off, Cyanide makes an appearance in no fewer than 10 Agatha Christie novels and 4 short stories. So she used cyanide to bump off 18 characters, apparently. That's pretty amazing. So cyanide is naturally occurring at a lot of different things, including the pits of peaches, cherries, and even apples.
That's one of the reasons why they say you're not supposed to eat the core of apples, because there are some people who do that. Although I believe you'd have to eat 70 cores of apples to do any damage.
I think you'd have to eat even more than that. There's like a really funny anecdote about a lawyer who tried to use the defense that my client didn't poison the deceased. They just ate a whole bunch of apples, and ever afterward, the lawyer was named like Apple Pips or something because it was such a ridiculous defense.
Right.
But one food item that does contain massive amounts of cyanide are bitter almonds. And of course, whenever we deal with cyanide, especially in Christie, she always mentions the bitter almond smell. But what's so interesting is that, so it's not that cyanide smells like bitter almonds. It's that bitter almonds actually smell like cyanide. Like, that is what cyanide smells like. It's the massive amounts of cyanide in bitter almonds that are making it smell like that, i.e. like cyanide. I did also find it fascinating that cyanide is still so deadly that 95% of accidental cyanide poisonings to this day are fatal. It's just very fast acting. One of the joys of A is for Arsenic is how much it lauds Christie's acumen and expertise when it comes to poisoning. She got so much right. But one thing she did get wrong was the blue in the face thing. So the way cyanide works is actually to bind with hemoglobin in the blood so that it's actually replacing oxygen molecules that would otherwise be delivered to the cells of the body. So when you die of cyanide, what's actually happening is
you're suffocating.
No, it's just massive cellular death. It's like your very cells are dying, and it's creating all sorts of failures, including potentially suffocating, seizures, just a mess. But because it's replacing oxygen that would otherwise bind to hemoglobin, you actually have more oxygen than if not in your blood, which means that cyanide victims actually tend to be flushed, i.e. red. not blue, because blue is what comes from the absence of oxygen. The reason why blue face, like being blue in the face, is called a cyanosed face is that the root word for cyanide and cyanosis, the blue face syndrome, they both have their root in the Greek word for blue. I won't really go into it, but it's just like there was a blue pigment that was used to create a very common form of hydrogen cyanide, which is how the word blue came to be used to name the poison of cyanide. But cyanide itself doesn't necessarily make you blue. I wonder if Christie just the cyanosed face, and then she just sort of went from there. And I just found that fascinating. All right. So that's Iris. Let's switch to Ruth Lessing's point of view.
Right. And we find out she's absolutely brilliant and a perfect secretary and the essential right hand to George. I mean, she does everything from like his books to handling problems for him to decorating his new country house. So when Victor Drake becomes a problem, yet again, he's always asking the family for money. George sends Ruth with a minimal amount of money to pay off Victor Drake and then ship him off to Argentina to get him as far away as possible from the family. But when she meets Victor, he is roguishly charming, and he also has a pretty good read on her. He sees that she's smarter than her station and that she's been mistreated, not just by George, but by Rosemary, who is really described as this sort of like vapid monster.
Yeah, Ruth Lessing realizes after her tete-a-tete with Victor that she hates Rosemary.
Right.
And that he's actually, and he was absolutely right, and he has her number perfectly. He just really gets her goat, you know? She feels like he's kind of ruined her life. It's a wonderful sequence, actually. I mean, again, this first half of the book, I find from a character standpoint is so strong. You completely get who Ruth is and how devastating this interaction was with Victor, because she thought that she knew who he was and she was going to dispense with him, and she just loathed this weak charactered man, and then he just completely turns the tables and makes her question her entire existence, and it's pretty fantastic. All right, so that's Ruth. Next up, we have Anthony Brown, the aforementioned Romeo who had been in love with Rosaline, i.e. Rosemary. He was pretty much just infatuated by her. One of the reasons why things went south with Rosemary is that she found out from Victor Drake that Anthony Brown is not his real name, and that he, in fact, has an Italian name, and he was previously in prison. And she starts taunting him with this information, and he gets really angry really fast. He gets very nasty, actually.
Really, really defensive about it, because he seems, by all accounts, to sort of have this respectable life, and he finds her absolutely loathsome as a result of what she's doing.
This just struck me as such an unusual couple of sentences in a Christie novel. This is what he says when he's trying to convince her to just stop talking about his fake name. Look here, Rosemary, this is dangerous. You don't want your lovely face carved up, do you?
I know.
There are people who don't stick at a little thing like ruining a girl's beauty, and there's such a thing as being bumped off. Am I reading Chandler here? Kane?
I know.
What's happening?
I know. It's really grisly.
It's an evocative moment, and there's a lot of mystery surrounding him when he is first presented. It's funny. Anthony Brown and Victor Drake are both presented as ne'er-do-wells. Only one of them at the end of the story will still be a ne'er-do-well. And it's actually Anthony who is described as having, quote, the quick, stealthy step of a wild creature, a panther perhaps, or a leopard. The fellow wasn't really quite civilized. That is totally Philip Lombard, i.e. Monty.
I know.
All right, who do we have next?
We have Stephen Faraday, who is our aforementioned conservative MP. He had pulled himself up by his bootstraps, and in part he gets his sort of extra bump in his success through Lady Alexandra's family. He courts her deliberately because, and this is really horrible, she's basically the plainest and least eligible of the family's 5 daughters. The problem is she doesn't look like Rosemary, so when they go on holiday in France, Stephen sees Rosemary across the room, and he has told Sandra that he fell in love with her across the room, which is like the real cruel twist of the knife here. But he does fall in love with Rosemary across the room, and then he begins a 6-month-plus torrid affair that involved a secret flat in London, and he's convinced that Sandra doesn't know, and he also becomes increasingly disillusioned with Rosemary for being incredibly stupid and incredibly clingy, especially when she begins threatening to tell their spouses that they are going to run off to the Caribbean together, which he has no interest in and thinks is the dumbest idea of all time. And he, frankly, begins to fantasize about murdering her.
On top of all this, we then switch to Lady Alexandra, or Sandra's, point of view. And she, of course, not only did she know exactly what he was doing from the get-go, like from the moment that he approached her, because she is smart and she is savvy, she, of course, knows about the affair with Rosemary. She knew the second that Stephen saw Rosemary from across that room when they were on holiday what was going to happen. And she has also herself been harboring a seething hatred for Rosemary, for fairly obvious reasons, but maybe one not so obvious reason, which is that despite this affair and her clear-eyed view of her husband, she actually very much loves her husband. And she loves being his partner, and she doesn't want that destroyed. I have to say, these two characters, Stephen and Sandra, I think are the best characters in the book.
These two chapters are the best chapters in the book.
And these two chapters with Stephen and Sandra are some of the best writing that Christie has done. They're character studies in two people that would not be out of place in an Anthony Trollope novel.
No,
right?
You know what? I agree. And you know what the most interesting thing is that what Stephen ends up saying to himself is that he actually is in love with his wife. It took having to be around this person in Rosemary, who he thinks is so vile. He realizes that the only thing in the entire world he wants is his relationship with his wife. That is the single most valuable thing in life to him.
I copied it out of the book because it's so beautifully written. This is Stephen coming to the realization that he actually loves his wife. And suddenly, with a shock of surprise, he realized that it was that he would mind most. He'd lose Sandra. Sandra with her square white forehead and her clear hazel eyes. Sandra, his dear friend and companion, his arrogant, proud, loyal Sandra. No, he couldn't lose Sandra. He couldn't. Anything but that. Also, Stephen's rise to prominence politically really is like ripped out of a Trollope Palliser novel. He has this whole series of political hijinks novels that are fantastic, and this would belong right in there. And it also reminded me of in Bel Canto, there's this lovely French couple, Simon and Edith. They, too, are an older married couple who only discover more than a decade, I think almost 20 years into their marriage, that they have this deep and enduring love for each other that they never actually had when they got married. It's handled so beautifully. Like, Anne Patchett can write that sort of thing so well. And Christie pulls it off here, too. Like, I love how they cling to each other, and they're so scared at what they're going to lose, because they're basically both realize that maybe the other person killed Rosemary because it's very clear up front, I think, especially from Sandra's point of view. I think she 100% believes that Stephen killed Rosemary. Yeah, there's so much roiling under the surface at that breakfast table.
Right.
I love it.
Right.
Yet again, by the way, it's another Christie wish fulfillment of a man straying and realizing how much he actually does, in fact, love his wife. She knew how to write that.
Yikes.
So that is Stephen and Sandra. And then our final perspective before we get to the second dinner is George Barton, Rosemary's husband, who, as we mentioned, is very paranoid and is getting increasingly weird because he's receiving these letters that are telling him that, Rosemary didn't commit suicide. She was murdered. So he naturally suspects someone at that dinner. So one of the people we have just gone through. He, in fact, moves to a country house that's a few miles away from the Faradays' country house, and he's pretty much stalking them because he knows that Rosemary was having an affair either with Stephen or with Anthony Brown. He just gets weirder and weirder as time goes on. So finally, he brings over his old friend, none other than Colonel Race, to ask him for some advice.
He retells the story of the original dinner where Rosemary dies, and they go through the 7 members of the dinner party one by one. And actually, Colonel Race was supposed to be the 8th. but he couldn't make it.
He didn't show up, which is something Colonel Race seems to do a lot of.
I know.
So George ends up asking all of the original attendees to a replica dinner party, which is also at the Luxembourg, and he convinces all of them to attend. The Faradays in particular seem acutely aware that they are being led into a trap, but they don't want it to appear that they know it's a trap and are avoiding it, because that would obviously make them seem guilty. So They all show up to this dinner club, and what happens?
The group dances, there's a performance, it's a posh supper club. They toast Iris because it's her 18th birthday. And then George drinks his champagne and promptly dies. We are explicitly told it takes a minute and a half. There's no clear indication of who possibly could have killed him. The drinks didn't appear to have been messed with. Nobody else was near their table. So a year later from the first death, now this seems pretty clear that this is a murder and it has to be one of them.
Race joins up with a Chief Inspector Kemp of Scotland Yard to investigate the murders. And Kemp is where we get our Superintendent Battle reference. And I couldn't help myself. I had to pull out that reference as well because I so enjoyed it. This is what Christie writes. Kemp was slightly reminiscent of that grand old veteran, Battle, in type. Indeed, since he had worked under Battle for many years, he had perhaps unconsciously copied a good many of the older man's mannerisms. He bore about him the same suggestion of being carved all in one piece. But whereas Battle had suggested some wood such as teak or oak, Chief Inspector Kemp suggested a somewhat more showy wood, mahogany, say, or good old-fashioned rosewood. Sure. I appreciated that. That was a nice little nod to Superintendent Battle. So Kemp and Race investigate. And what happens next in the book is a bit repetitive. It's largely a recapping of what we've already just laid out. You could argue that there is a dragging the marsh situation going on here in the middle of the book. We do, though, get something new. And that is some eyewitness testimony from other attendees of the Luxembourg Club. In particular, an especially astute and observant blonde lovely. And she explains that two things happened at this table where all of our suspects were sitting. The couples went off dancing, as previously noted, but nobody came to the table except for a waiter who picked up a green bag. And we know that bag had belonged to Iris. It had fallen to the floor, and the waiter just put it back on the table. And other than that, there was no action at the table. We also get some information about the number of bottles of champagne. There were 2, and that they had been handled only by the very trusted restaurant employee, Charles, who everyone in London knew. So it doesn't seem that there could be any funny business going on there. Christie is very specific not only about the order in which they're arranged around the table, but also the blocking of the night. And we don't have to get too specific about it, but the only thing I think it's helpful to know at this point is that there was a toast to Iris for her 18th birthday, and the champagne had been poured at that point. Everyone drank their champagne except for Iris, since, of course, one does not drink when one is the subject of the toast. And then everyone got up to dance, and that's the point at which the blonde lovely said no one came to the table. So it's all very confusing how George Barton's drink then, which he drank before he got up to dance, magically had cyanide in it. How was this possible? So that's kind of the conundrum we are left with. And now it is time for some clues to bridge us over into the world as it actually is. Take it away, Catherine.
There's basically one clue in this book, and we already mentioned it. It's the waiter moving the bag, because it is a weirdly specific detail to bring up if that's not going to matter. Turns out it does matter.
And to be clear, when we're told the bag is moved, all we're told is that this green bag, which we know is Iris's, fell to the floor, and a waiter, in passing, put it back on the table. And we know that the waiter was not the waiter who was attending to their table. It was just this harried young waiter who saw it and put it back. An astute reader may wonder if the bag was put back in the same place from which it fell. And of course, the answer to that is no. And therein lies the crux of the puzzle mystery to be solved, because if the bag was placed in a different spot, Iris and George, we are told, are the first people to come back to the table, and we know that they are sitting next to each other, meaning that if Iris comes back and sits in a different spot, George is going to be sitting in a different spot too. And the glass of champagne that he subsequently drinks, which is poisoned, the only persons it could be
would have to be the glass of champagne that has not been touched yet, i.e. Iris's. So he must in fact have drunk Iris's glass, which must have contained the cyanide, meaning Iris was the intended victim. There are quite a few steps involved in that clue, and it is pretty tricky and devious, and I would argue a bit problematic, and we will certainly discuss that a lot more when we get to our rankings, but there you go.
Once we get to that Iris is the intended victim here, not George, that leads us very logically to our clue number 2, which is to never, ever ignore inheritance business in a Christie novel. And remember that we started this with this weirdo situation when it comes to Iris and Rosemary and the fortune and how that all works. So What we should ask ourselves is, who is going to inherit all that money that Iris had coming to her very shortly? It would presumably go to her next of kin. We don't know that for sure, but that's an assumption that we can and should absolutely make.
Right.
So who in this story is her next of kin? That would be her elderly companion, half-aunt figure, Lucilla Drake, and Lucilla's son, Victor.
Right. And then on top of this is not exactly a clue, but I would say there's like a little bit of an Occam's razor thing here. And who is it that's constantly described, and I mean constantly, as in probably every chapter of the book, described as the most competent person in the story? Christie does two things with extremely competent people. Either they end up being the secret hero and figuring everything out, or let's just say maybe they're the villain.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say that there's actually a fourth clue here, and it relates to something that I love to make fun of Christie for, but I think she was actually using it for her own purposes here quite masterfully. Within this investigative section of the book, when they're talking to the blonde lovely, they also talk to her dinner companion, who is a Pedro Morales.
Right.
And Christie has the most idiom-laden American dialogue coming out of Pedro Morales' mouth that I have ever read. And as we all know at this point, that is really saying something, right? Because Christie loves to have, her American speaking some idiomatic nonsense. It's just so funny. This is what he says. "Went with Chrissy. That baby is sure hard-boiled. She said it was a good joint. Honey pie, I said. We'll go just where you say. It was a classy joint, that I'll admit. And do they know how to charge you? Sent me back the best part of $30, but the band was punk. They just couldn't seem to swing it." Somehow I kind of imagine Will Ferrell saying that. Yeah, that's a lot. But you know what? We should assume that whoever is saying that ridiculousness is not real. There are only two characters who we mentioned who are truly suspects who weren't actually at the dinner table. One of them was Aunt Lucilla. I'm sorry, she's not dressing up as Pedro Morales. So that should have us think very closely about Victor Drake, who, by the way, we should also mention his relationship with his mother is such that should Lucilla Drake herself inherit all of Iris's fortune, it is but a formality for that money to pass from mother to son, because she will give him anything that he wants.
He asks for. Yeah.
So with that focus, let's resolve this thing.
It becomes very clear to Race and Kemp that actually Anthony Brown is one of them. In other words, he's a spy.
He's like a government operative. He's a good guy.
Yeah.
Also, Iris is almost murdered another 2 times. Anthony is very protective of her in this regard. In some ways, at this point, he takes over the investigation himself. He definitely is a sort of third investigator here. Yeah, so we have Iris being almost run down by a car. And then when Race and Anthony go to check on her, she has gone upstairs to bed per her Aunt Lucilla. But Anthony then finds a piece of carpet wedged under the door. And when he bends down, he can smell gas. So he and Race break down the door and they find Iris with her head in the gas heater. Looks as if perhaps she tried to kill herself. But of course, at this point, we know that did not happen. Not the first time we've come across a would-be murder victim almost being gassed. Let's never forget that final sequence in The Moving Finger. So they realize that someone is after Iris at this point.
They get a doctor and they really weirdly cut to a resolution chapter where, a recovering Iris just basically asks Anthony to explain everything to her, which he does. Ruth was really swayed by Victor Drake, as it turns out, Kemper. His little talking to her about how she was being taken advantage of really got under her skin. It turns out that if we really think about it, all of the information about Victor Drake's whereabouts come from Ruth. if Ruth was lying about those whereabouts, then nobody else in this story knows where Victor Drake was. So she did pay him off. She did get him the ticket to Argentina, but they fudged the dates about when he was going. So when she said that she called his boss in Argentina, she didn't. He was there for both of the murders. And he and Ruth, they decided that they were going to kill Rosemary and Iris and take the money.
And then just by virtue of that waiter putting the bag back in the wrong spot, they messed up. Right. And then they tried to fix their problem by killing Iris 2 other times, but they continued to mess up until they were caught. The end. Let's talk really briefly about these 2 adaptations. So there was first a 1983 CBS TV movie of Sparkling Cyanide, and it is very much a TV movie from the 80s. From the start, it is super LA. It's set in Los Angeles, specifically Pasadena. There's lots of sax on the soundtrack, lots of palm trees. It's all very slinky and tawdry and big-haired. Perhaps the best way of expressing just how 80s this movie is that instead of being almost run over by a car, Iris is almost killed in a jet skiing accident. The second adaptation of the novel is from 2003, and this is a UK adaptation. It was done via ITV. And what these 2 adaptations have in common is that they both place the action in a contemporary setting, which is fine, but they're both lackluster without being offensively bad. And I was thinking about this, and I think the issue with both of them is that Rosemary is very much alive and well at the start of both of these stories. I think because it's just easier to tell the story if you start with Rosemary rather than
make it more linear.
Rather than doing it in all retrospect. However, as we discussed, that retrospective, the kind of like, let's figure out who Rosemary is from the perspective of all these different people, that's by far the best element in the novel, and it's the most intriguing aspect of the novel.
Well, also, by the way, that's why she's named Rosemary.
Right.
As we're reminded repeatedly.
We are told so much that rosemary, the herb, is for remembrance.
Right.
So because of that, we just have the kind of meat and potatoes of this story. There's not a whole lot more to say about either of these adaptations. I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention that Lucilla Drake in the 1983 TV movie is played by none other than Nancy Marchand.
Now, how did Victor put the cyanide into the champagne?
Far cry from Livia Soprano.
Somebody called here last night after dark.
Oh.
You think I'd answer? It was dark out.
She's having a lot of fun in this adaptation.
Right, and just coming off of Lou Grant, right?
Look, Mr. Grant, frankly, I am sick to the teeth of this manipulation of the news media by terrorism.
And we should also mention that Harry Morgan plays Kemp, the police captain here. There's no Colonel Race in either of these adaptations. And then real quick, in the 2003 version, this is set in the world of football. So George Barton is a very brash, pull himself up by his bootstraps team owner. We have a Colonel Jeffrey Reese, played by Oliver Ford Davies, who is married to a Dr. Catherine Kendall, played by Pauline Collins. And they are very much an old married sleuthing couple, a la Tommy and Tuppence. Their vibe is actually much closer to the real Tommy and Tuppence than what we saw in that fairly recent fiasco starring David Williams and Jessica Raine, Partners in Crime, which just did not capture Tommy and Tuppence. Like, they have a daughter who's just as clueless about what they actually do as Tommy and Tuppence's children were. And it's good. I mean, they're by far the best part of that adaptation, but there's no point of them putting it in the world of football. As our friend Mark Aldridge said, such a change of setting owed more debt to the channels than popular high camp drama series Footballers' Wives than anything in Christie's original story. I think that's true. They also use a lot of technology that feels very overloaded and rushed, and they use it to get through the plot at the end just way too quickly. You can tell that they're cheating with it.
Here, just after 8 o'clock on the night that Barton died. Must have thought that no one would recognise him in that scarf. Even though you can hardly see his face, the digital recognition system on the CCTV a few hundred metres away picks him up.
It's just fine. It's a touch trashy. The renderings of Rosemary and Iris felt a little trashy, especially in comparison to the detectives. They're both just kind of a disappointment. I think that Sparkling Cyanide could and should have a better adaptation. Perhaps one that actually just goes full period, because this is one of Christie's more swanky, high-class intrigue affairs.
Right.
You can have fun with that in period, setting it truly in the 40s. Not every Christie is set in such posh circles. People who aren't close readers of Christie might think that they are, but they're really not always, and I think that's part of the fun of this novel. So, all right, let's talk about the rankings. Let's talk about plot mechanics first and plot credibility, as we so often do. I actually think that this novel is one instance where it's quite easy to differentiate between mechanics and credibility, because I think most of the issues with this novel fall to credibility. I don't think that the mechanics here are superlative. I think we talked a bit already about how it feels somewhat repetitive in the middle after that gonzo opening. But, we do have that gonzo opening. I think the way that that's structured is really interesting and really bold. And that also goes to mechanics. I mentioned that idiomatic American dialogue that I really appreciated. I'm totally going to give Christie the benefit of the doubt there, because that really was Victor Drake pretending to be Pedro Morales, the trashy American. Here's the issue. George dying rather than Iris creates 90% of the obfuscation that powers this book, and it's pleasing, but I don't know if the solution is entirely satisfying. So I would like to talk about that under the umbrella of plot credibility, because it could happen. That could absolutely happen if you have 7 people sitting at a table and a waiter who doesn't know any better puts a bag at the next place. However, really, no one noticed? One of the people sitting there was murdering people and ended up murdering the wrong person because of this switch that happened with the places. We really don't think that cool, competent, efficient Ruth Lessing would have noticed that the seats had switched a place. It's also, by the way, only a 7-seater table. Not that I believe that she could have pulled off like 13 characters at this dinner table. I just don't really believe that at a 7-seater table that no one would have noticed that they moved a place. And here's another reason I'll just throw out there why they wouldn't notice, and it has to do with that bag. Did Ruth and Sandra not have bags?
They had black purses. And you would think that, yes, they would be on their chairs, right?
Mm-hmm. That's a problem.
Yeah.
Their bags would have been sitting where they had left them, so they would have been able to position themselves properly, right? I mean, it's clever, but it's not quite believable. I'll say this. It's not as egregious as a woman not realizing that she married the same man twice. At all. It's not. It's not that bad, but it's not great.
Yeah, that's always going to take the cake on credibility.
Sure.
It is clever until you try to think about it for more than a second.
Which is usually not the case with Christie. Usually it's clever and you obsess over it and start banging your head with your own fist thinking, why didn't I think of that? It's so obvious. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, though, the motivation for the murder makes sense. I think that section with Ruth Lessing in the first part of the book where she's talking about how Victor Drake changed everything and she was never the same after she talked to him and how much she hated Rosemary. You know what? That was absolutely truthful. She was putting us on notice, and it was Christie doing her thing and layering it in there in a masterful way. Like, that's all what's good.
Really funny is that I remembered some of the details of this book, but I did not remember who did it until I started reading that chapter, and I was like, oh yeah, it was her.
Yeah. For some reason, I did remember that Ruth did it. I think, what I also remembered too? I think it's Victor Drake who says, your name is not very apt, right? Because you have no pity. You're pitiless. You have no Ruth. You're ruthless, and then of course she ends up being the murderer. But where I would come down on this is a 6 for mechanics and a 4 for plot credibility. Pretty low because of that specific issue. Like, it's just tethered to that one specific thing, but in that it's the crux of the obfuscation that's driving this mystery, it's really important.
We don't have anything else.
Exactly.
I mean, so yeah, I'm completely okay with that.
Okay. Then we come to series-long characters, and this is our final Colonel Race novel. We have...
Are you really distraught over this?
I'm not distraught, but it's been a it's been quite a ride with Colonel Race, starting with The Man in the Brown Suit, podcast favorite, then Cards on the Table, Death on the Nile, which is probably his best outing. He's an outlier, obviously, when it comes to Christie detectives. He's barely a series-long character. It's a little bit of a stretch to even call him that, but I did appreciate that Christie describes him as having a sunburnt face, closely cropped iron gray hair, and shrewd dark eyes. Colonel Race is definitely a handsome man.
Oh,
we know that.
I don't think there is no doubt about that. We knew that back in The Man in the Brown Suit.
Yeah, and we also get a great Man in the Brown Suit in-joke, where Christie writes, Colonel Race was not good at small talk and might indeed have posed as the model of a strong, silent man, so beloved by an earlier generation of novelists, because he's 100% the strong, silent man in The Man in the Brown Suit. And then South Africa is name-checked farther down that very same page. So
right.
And I even appreciated that Superintendent Battle reference. Because this is his final outing, I'd like to give him something a little more than middling, but let's be honest, it's Colonel Race. I don't think he deserves a lot more, which is why I would argue that a 6 is appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, he just doesn't really have much of a character. And then weirdly enough, Anthony really ends up taking over the investigation. And then also Chief Inspector Kemp probably has more of a prominent role than Race does.
But you know what? I mean, I'm almost playing devil's advocate at this point, because for some reason, I do have some lingering affection for Colonel Race. And we talk about how Superintendent Battle is unusual among Christie detectives because he has no superhuman skill. He's not clever. He just plods on through, which is interesting because it's different. And I think Race is interesting in being different too, in that he doesn't have that much of a presence. Like
Race is
Christie's
spy,
most
though.
absent detective.
But I mean, isn't it heavily implied that Race is a spy?
Oh, it's not heavily implied. It's stated. Yeah, he's a spy. I mean, in The Man in the Brown Suit, it's like he's in love with Anne Bedingfeld, because how could he not be? She's so delightful.
Of course. The best.
But by the end of that novel, he's chosen, the life of government service over any sort of personal happiness. Like, this is just the person that he is. And you could argue that the same thing is going on with Poirot, but, he's Papa Poirot, and he gets himself involved in the intricacies of human emotions and relationships all the time. And Race just doesn't. He himself is a bit of a ghost,
isn't Race is like a George Smiley, right?
Yeah. And I think like his very absence is actually part of, what Christie is doing here on purpose with him. And I'm just arguing for a 6, Catherine.
I'm okay with a 6.
All right. That makes me very happy.
We're on the same page.
Okay. And I'm also going to go hard on characters, but my sense is that you would agree, because I think it's not a stretch to say that is by far the best part of this book, is the book specific characters. Not every single one of them. They're not all created equally. Iris Marl herself, I think, is meant to be a little bit more interesting than she is.
She's not interesting at all.
She's kind of like the ingenue, though, like she's young and she's impressionable, and it's a bit of an annoying character, but it's not badly
and also there's like a very creepy subplot that bears mentioning in this category about how Anthony tries to get her to lie about her age in order for them to marry.
That's kind of when we're wondering if Anthony Brown isn't actually the murderer after all, because he's just after Iris for her money.
Right.
But I suppose he's just so gosh darn in love with her, he just wants to marry her now.
I guess so. It doesn't make it any less unsettling.
Sure.
Frankly.
I think that's fair. But, Iris is not terribly drawn, so it's a little bit of a quibble to even point her out. I think Anthony Brown is well drawn, and Victor Drake. I mean, those are two Christie stock characters, but obviously Stephen and Sandra Faraday are superb. My only problem with the end, by the way, is that, we get Iris and Anthony's happy ending. But you know what I want? I just want to see Sandra and Stephen at the breakfast table, just being happy with each other. Just being, they're going to rule the world together. We know that's what's going to happen anyway. I guess we don't need it. That's what Christie would argue. We don't even need it. But
I guess, he's going to end up as PM, I suppose, right?
Oh, they're going to be the much more functional Underwoods. That reference is boomeranging completely back around, since House of Cards, of course, is originally a British
I know. I was going to say. Yeah.
Even the longest, the most glittering reign must come to an end someday.
I think they're superb. I do think that Ruth Lessing, and particularly the way that she's affected by Victor Drake, which turns out to be quite central to solving the puzzle mystery, is fantastically drawn. And even George Barton himself, his befuddlement and his idiocy, he ends up getting himself killed. It's sad, but it's convincing.
What's funny is that I read Ruth Lessing the entire time. And in my head was picturing Ruth Wilson as Alice on Luther.
This is a black hole. It consumes matter, sucks it in, and crushes it beyond existence. When I first heard that, I thought that's evil at its most pure, something that drags you in, crushes you, makes you nothing.
Just the name coincidence, but I kind of just was like, yeah, that seems right.
I think that speaks well for Ruth Lessing. Huge Ruth Wilson fan.
Mm-hmm.
I think an 8. I mean, I would say a 9, but I think a 9's probably a bit much.
I think an 8, mostly because I think Iris is a really bad character. It's preventing me from going to a 9.
I think we only reserve, the last 9 we gave was for And Then There Were None. We did a 10 for Five Little Pigs, but we did an 8 for Sad Cypress, which also has outstanding characters. So, I mean, I think we cannot go any more than that, though. I think an 8 is as high as we can go for characters, but we should. So let's do 8.
It definitely deserves an 8. They're really good.
Okay. And then setting and tone, this is one of those cases where being a catch-all category, I think you could argue in a couple of different directions. For readability, I think I probably still come out much more positive than you do, Catherine. I know you were irked by the repetitive nature of the story. I found it very readable. Even though I acknowledge that criticism, I breezed right through it, especially the first half, but even the second half. I think that this is Christie still at the height of her writing prowess, and we can see that with the character studies in the first half of the novel. And I think for once, her evocation of London is quite good, and we don't always get that. And it's nothing specific because it usually isn't with Christie, but we were just saying this is one of her posher, more
right. There's a reference to Sandra, I believe, wearing Schiaparelli, which I thought was interesting because we don't often get name drops like that in Christie.
I would argue that when we're giving Christie credit for evoking a setting, it's almost always a foreign setting, which is part of the purpose of the novel. She tends to get a bit more evocative when she's abroad, or it's some sort of a country-ish setting where it's the town or occasionally an estate, although usually her estates are pretty anonymous too. But London usually is not her strong point, I would say. And I think here she actually pulls it off. There's this glittering element to the novel that starts with the title, but she pulls it off throughout, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I actually really liked the details about the wait staff at Luxembourg.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Charles, who's the maitre d', I suppose, right?
Yeah.
I liked all the details about the mechanics of that.
I mean, here's what I would argue, and it's funny, we've now done enough of these novels that I'm just kind of looking at the trajectory of our setting and tone category, which has slowly but surely inched higher. At least the average value of it has certainly inched higher as we've gone from the 20s through the 30s into the 40s. And I think that's fair because I think that even though we have certain books that don't work as well as others, this is the category where we're talking about a lot of those kind of ineffable writerly qualities. And she's on her game. I mean, unfortunately, I think this category is going to dip again as the quality of some of the novels dips, especially in the much, much later years. But this is where she is firing on all cylinders. We've had a bunch of 7s in the recent past, and this to me feels like another 7. I think it's good. I think that she's...
I think a 7 is good. And I mean, stylistically, it almost deserves more because stylistically, it's really good for half of it. Or a third of it. And the problem for me ultimately is that I found it really inconsistent at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Because of the repetitive quality of the
and
second half.
It loses some of its spunk. You know what I mean? Because it's like very aggressively honest in the beginning too. That's what we were talking earlier about the Faradays. And I thought that was fascinating.
I know exactly what you mean, actually. Like, I didn't think of that until you just said it, but this book starts out as one of Christie's better written books, and it kind of decays into more of a standard ho-hum Christie by the end. Do you know what I mean?
I absolutely know what you mean. It's that it structurally changes 70 or 80 pages in. It structurally changes to the Colonel Race, Inspector Kemp thing, who, I'm sorry, aren't interesting.
Yeah, and it just becomes standard, which is still wonderful, obviously. You know, standard Christie is still
well, it's a little weird. It reminded me a little bit, and this is going to sound like a huge insult at some level, and I don't actually mean it as one. I had this feeling that I did with Dumb Witness, where you get Hastings doing the entire thing up front, which is like compelling. And then all of a sudden you just have to go back again.
Yeah, I hear that. And that's why I think it's not an 8, but it is a 7.
Yeah, I think a 7.
Okay. Then Stuck in Its Time, I would give this 0. As always, there are a couple of uncomfortable moments that we could point out. Rosemary and Leopard, who is, of course, Stephen Faraday, when they're exchanging their love letters. At one point he says...
She's his Ethiopian?
Yeah, did the leopard miss his Ethiopian? Because the joke is that he had bought her a man-spotted dressing gown, which is the dressing gown in which the letter is found. And it's, you know, the leopard changing his spots, but you mustn't change your skin, darling, which is why he calls her, quote, his Ethiopian, and also Black Beauty. Here's the thing, though. None of those, and there might be a couple of other questionable references.
They're in the mouths of the characters, and so it's more forgivable, I guess.
It's more forgivable, or even if it's via the narration with the scene setting at the Luxembourg, it certainly doesn't overwhelm the story. And it feels to me like a fairly sophisticated portrayal of, you know, an upper class kind of
1945
mid-40s milieu. And not one that seems rife with any racism, at least on the surface. You know, like that's not the focus of the novel, obviously. So in that, I think we have to be a little relative with this category and, you know, think about...
No, of course. And I mean, that's why we've always been trying to be considerate of this category. If something is egregious, it should be called out. And if it's not... Yeah, I guess no deductions.
All right, so that brings us to an end of our rankings discussion, giving us a grand total for Sparkling Cyanide of 6 plus 4 plus 6 plus 8 plus 7 minus 0, 31 points, putting Sparkling Cyanide in, oh yes, a tie, because we always have ties at this point. I honestly prefer having ties because I feel like being able to wedge it between specific titles makes me feel truly comfortable about where the novel ends up. And I'm always comfortable with the grouping, and this is no exception for me anyway. See how you feel, Catherine.
Okay.
Sparkling Cyanide is right now in a tie with Lord Edward Dies, The Body in the Library, and The Sitterford Mystery at 31 points.
Yeah, that actually seems perfect.
Yeah, and here's where I come out. It is certainly not better than Lord Edward Dies. I think Lord Edward Dies should be higher. And that's currently in 15th place.
I mean, it does have my arch nemesis.
It does. That's true. I think it is certainly better than The Sitterford Mystery. The question is, do we put it above or below The Body in the Library? And I'm very much torn about that.
Interesting. I mean, I would probably give The Body in the Library the benefit of the ranking just because it's Miss Marple.
Yeah. It's also, you know, that one is Christie's satirization to a certain extent of the genre. There's a lot going on in that short novel. I agree. I think my sense is we should probably put it between The Body in the Library and The Sitterford Mystery.
Yeah.
All right. So then we have placed Sparkling Cyanide in 17th place of 36 novels currently. So almost right in the middle, which feels right to me. I mean, this is a good novel.
I would also note that once you start getting into that range, they're all good.
Yeah. I mean, we're getting to the point where anything in the top 20 out of 36 is excellent. You know, it's not just the top 10. Like when we only had 15 novels ranked, obviously the top 10 meant a lot more than it does now.
Like, I still really like The Sitterford Mystery.
Oh, I do too. But this is better.
Yeah, it is.
right. Well, that brings us to an end of Sparkling Cyanide. As we mentioned, next week we will be covering Yellow Iris, the short story that Christie expanded to create Sparkling Cyanide. In the meantime, we'd love to hear from you. Please check out our Patreon website, www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. And you can always email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. Catherine is at Brobcat. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha. Our Instagram handle is at All About Agatha. And we so appreciate the ratings and reviews. They are still coming in and we still very much need them. So please take a moment and do that. And we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.